Hello, everybody. My name is Enrique Mendizabal. I think it's now time, so we should start. I just want to check that the main speakers for today can hear me and are ready. Ana Patricia, Julie, and Guillermo, are you there?
Yes.
Guillermo.
Hello, Enrique.
Hi, Guillermo.
How are you?
Good morning. Ana Patricia.
Good morning. Happy to be here.
Great. And Julie?
Yes, I'm here as well. Looking forward to it.
Great. Okay, thank you very much. To everybody else, I ask you to mute your microphones while we go through the webinar, and then towards the end, you'll have a chance to ask a few questions. So my name is Enrique Mendizabal. I'm a director of Think Tanks, and this is the first in a series of new webinars organized in partnership with ILAIP, the network of Latin American think tanks, with the support of the Think Tank Initiative. This webinar is being recorded, so if you don't get a chance to catch everything, you can watch it later, and also, of course, we'll share it with others. I think you can see Guillermo now, who will be giving the main presentation. Guillermo Gonzalez is the outgoing, or actually former executive director of Espacio Público, a think tank in Chile that has been doing excellent work for someone who is not in Chile. I've been noticing a lot of the work around elections, transparency around elections, which is quite inspiring and interesting for us in Peru. But Guillermo will be able to tell you more about that. Guillermo will tell us about a very interesting story of business model change, almost 180 degrees from an organization that was highly dependent on core funding to one that is no longer dependent on core funding, and in fact is quite comfortable working with project funding. Something that I think resonates with many organizations around the world. His presentation will be followed by a few comments and questions by Julie LaFrance. Many of you know Julie. Julie is a senior program specialist at the Think Tank Initiative, and I believe now she's spending this year in Montevideo, looking after the Latin American think tanks. And then finally, Ana Patricia Muñoz, who is executive director at Grupo Faro. And Ana Patricia is new to the job. She's taken over just a few months ago. She will also add a few comments, questions, and discuss the relevance of Espacio Público's experience to an organization like Faro, and of course, hopefully to other organizations in the region and in other parts of the world. We'll have a chance at the end to ask a few questions, so I ask you to let me know via the chat facility if you have any questions to ask, and I'll give you a chance to do so. Great. So I hope this will take about an hour, maybe a little bit more. But if we can wrap it up in an hour, I think that would be fantastic. So we leave on a high. So now it's over to you, Guillermo.
Okay. So I'm gonna share the presentation here. Give me a second. Tell me if it's working okay.
Yes.
Give me a second. There we go. Can you see it, Enrique? Is that fine there? Okay.
I can see it fine.
Okay, so thank you very much, Enrique. I'm very glad to be able to deliver this webinar. Give me 1 second, please. I'm gonna do something so that we don't have any interruptions in the middle. There we go. So, so as I said, thank you very much. I'm very glad to have the opportunity to talk to other think tanks in the region, and from outside of the region. I'm very glad to have our African friends from different countries in Africa here today. The interview that you saw on Think Tank's website, and now this webinar came up after we had a coffee last year with Enrique. I told him very briefly about the kinds of things we were doing in Espacio Público and about this change that I'm going to tell you in more detail today. And he said, oh, that's a very interesting experience, and probably that will be very interesting for other think tanks in the region and elsewhere. And up until then, I was was so much in among the trees that I couldn't really see the forest and see how relevant this could be. So I'm very glad it can be of some value to people else in other parts of the world. Of course, as we all know, think tanks come in all shapes and colors. So this is going to be more useful to some of you than others. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Espacio Público later on, so that you know where I'm talking from. But I still hope that at least a little bit of what I'm going to show you today is valuable and can be useful for your work in your think tanks. So basically, I'm going to start off from the year 2015. We realized we had a pretty big problem. We had been living basically on core funding for all that time, and that was going to end at the end of that year. We up until then we were this was early 2015. We were unable to renew any of those core funding, any of that core funding that we had, and so we knew there was a cliff, an income cliff coming up, and we had to do something about it, And so probably that resonates to some of you, and I'm going to tell you about what we did about it, And as I said before, I just want to tell you a little bit about Espacio Público before, so that you know where this all comes from. First of all, this is a pretty new organization. It was set up in 2012, so by 2015 we'll have 3 years of existence. That means we didn't have a huge load, a burden, a historical burden, and that probably made it easier to make this change. It was established back then by a group of 18 really outstanding scholars and practitioners from Chile, a former finance minister, a former president of the central bank, a Pritzker Prize awardee, an architect that's known worldwide. So a really, really, really good group. And they got together and they decided to create this space because they wanted to have a space to contribute to the public debate. So our African friends, Espacio Público means public space in Spanish. And so they wanted this new space for them to get together, discuss different policy issues, and go out with really concrete proposals. All of the people who founded, all of those 18 people made up the board. It was renewed every 2 years. Currently, we have 23 board members, and they all work pro bono, right? They have a lot of, they're, as I said, very, very respected in Chile, but they have their jobs, and this is one extra thing they do in their lives, right? And they do it for free. The purpose of Espacio Público is to tackle current and emerging issues and to make concrete policy proposals based on applied research. We really it was really part of the original idea for this group of people to actually be able to have the vision to identify those topics that were coming up in the policy agenda, and tackle it, and go deeply into research, and then come up with very concrete proposals and influence the decision-making process in Chile. Right? That was really key. This was not a thing that's functional to a political party. It's not a think tank that works directly with legislators. It was the board, this group who wanted to have the control of the kinds of things they would work on and make proposals on, and so that's very key to what I'm going to tell you later on. That also means that we have from the very beginning, a very broad programmatic agenda. We do health, we do education, democracy, consumer protection, sustainability, cities, etc. So a very broad agenda under this logic that we have to be prepared to get into different issues that come up in the political discussion. The initial focus was in Chile. Probably this is kind of obvious to our Latin American friends here, but not to the African friends. Chile has been an OECD member since 2010. That means that's the club of the rich nations, right? And so Chile is one of the most developed countries in the region, and that also will come up later on. And from the very beginning, we had very, very strict funding policies. The board was very, very cautious in terms of avoiding conflicts of interest. So from the very beginning, we said, we're not going to receive any funding from government, any funding from corporations or individuals in Chile, and basically that only that opened the door to international funding, right? And we'll come back to that as well. So what was the what I call the core funding era? The first 3 years of Espacio Público, basically we had 2 funders who committed to support to our work. They committed to support our work for 3 years. And basically they say, we trust you, we trust the board, go ahead and set up this think tank and do absolutely what you think is best for Chile. And that gave us absolute control of our programmatic agenda. Every year, the board would get together and define what were the issues that we would do research on and work on during the following year. And so it was, in that sense, we had total control. We had a very light internal research team. These were outstanding professionals, but this was their first job. So they were 23, 24 years old, the top students from the top universities in Chile, but they had no previous professional experience, because the idea was that they would just provide support to these board members who also acted as senior researchers in our research projects, right? And we did have from the very beginning some fundraising effort, but it was very limited. We thought it would be as easy as to renew the core funding we got originally. It would be as easy as it was originally. It was indeed surprisingly easy. I can say now. And they thought, it's just going to be a few conversations, a few meetings, and we're going to be able to renew it and get even more international funders giving us core funding. And that was not the case. We could not get a single other international funder. And actually, one of the two original ones, when we got back to them after 3 years, they said, the original deal was 3 years. We really wish you a lot of luck, but that's it, And we could actually renew by the end of that year the commitment of the second funder. But and this is key, They said the same thing, we're surprised. We thought it was only for 3 years. And so we went back to them and we told them, in order to make sure so that you can be totally sure that we're not going to come back after the 6th year, why don't you give us each year a little bit less money? So they gave us the same amount the same amount they had given us up until then on the 4th year, and then it went back. It went down to 60% of that amount in the 5th year, and on the 6th year we got 40% and 0 in the 7th year, which is this year, right? And that was key. That was key for a smooth transition. I think that if we had gotten a sudden drop in our income from one year to the other, that would have been really, really complicated for us. And this was I think part of a key part of this success story. So we had to plan for this new scenario. This was not something that came up after one workshop. This is just an image of one of the multiple workshops we had with the team. We had several meetings with our board members. This took months, probably all of 2015, part of 2016. This was a slow process. It was not something that we discovered from one day to the other. We tested some things that didn't work, and basically we came up with this new project funding era, which is what happened during the last 2 years, and that's continuing to happen this year, of course. And basically, what were the changes that we made? First, we moved from this very junior to a more senior research team. We needed them to have more autonomy in terms of getting the devising projects, carrying them out, in terms of being able to sit with a donor in their own right, and not have to be waiting for our board members, who, as I said before, this is a pro bono thing for them. They're very interested in the things we do, but they don't have time to go to every meeting. And we needed to have more expert people who could talk about who could have substantive conversations with our donors. And so that was key. That was pretty traumatic in terms of our team. We had to fire 3 people who had been working with us until then, and who were the junior staff, and hire the more senior. When I'm talking about senior researchers, I'm not talking about people who have 25 years experience. They had anywhere from 5 to 8 years of experience. They had a master's degree or a PhD in Europe or in the US or in Australia, and they were not super senior, but they were they had way more professional experience than our previous team, which had 0 experience, right? And then the other big change was that we had to make the whole organization fundraising oriented. We had to change the switch. That's an expression we have in Spanish. We had to change the way we were facing our day-to-day work. And concretely, some of the things we did was, one, we established fundraising goals. Each researcher got a goal in terms of fundraising, an annual goal, and then our international relations director got an aggregate goal that she could comply to, getting each researcher to accomplish their goal, or she could have one researcher getting more funds than their goal, and then another one could not get it, but that was an aggregate goal. And secondly, we had to streamline the proposal production process, I call it. What does that mean? We, and you all know probably that producing good proposals requires a lot of teamwork. We had to get the substance from the researchers. We had to get all the institutional information from our international relations director. I would give the more strategic guidelines, as well as our board members. The administrative officer in Espacio Público would look at the budget. So there's a lot of teamwork, usually under pressure, and so at the beginning it was not easy. This took us a while. This took us several months to get it smooth, and that was also key, and that's a wheel that probably now is working almost on its own, but it was not like that at the beginning. Of course, we needed to have more robust and complex administrative and financial work, because there's a lot of administrative reporting that we did not have in the past when we only had core funding, and that was also key. I hired a person who was the underdirector of another think tank in Chile, and who had experience doing this. So that was also very key to invest in that area, which is, as you all know, very key to maintaining a healthy relationship with the donors. One probably a consequence of this new era is the tension that was produced in terms of our programmatic agenda, right? We, up until then, as I said before, the board members could define yearly the kinds of the issues that they wanted to tackle. Now they could still say, we want to work on these issues, and that's what we kept doing, but we could only work on those issues once we got funding for those projects, right? In early 2016, the board said, we will not start any new project that does not get its own funding, and so that changed the kinds of things that we could actually do, right? I think we're very proud of being able to keep doing what we want to do in terms of the topics that we're tackling. But there were some issues that we are no longer able to do because we have been unable to get funding for them. I'm gonna get into more detail then at the end of the presentation. And then the other consequence was that, as I said before, Chile was an OECD member since 2010. That means that there is almost no international corporation funding for Chile. That means that we when we went to talk to donors, they said, Chile is not really on, not even if we want to, we cannot provide funding for Chile. But if you think about a regional project that involves other countries in the region, that could be of very much interest, especially because given that Chile is slightly more developed than other countries, then the other countries could learn from the successes and the failures of the Chilean experience, and so that led us to do several regional projects. We currently have 3 large-scale projects that involve anywhere from 3 to 10 countries in the region going on. Originally, it was just because of the funding, but then we ended up realizing that it was also great for us to learn about. Even for Chile, there's a lot to learn from the other countries, and it was really, really enriching for us to move in that direction. And the other thing that happens is that we move from the traditional think projects, the knowledge generation projects, to more do projects, where basically what we did there was to, for example, the anti-corruption work that we did. We basically created a platform with an activist organization, with a partner activist organization, where we kept track of the progress of the anti-corruption agenda defined by the previous government. We were not generating new knowledge. We were there, a watchdog in that issue. We have another project that was also sort of like a watchdog project, doing fact checking in the presidential election that took place last year, at the end of last year. So. And that also gave us way more visibility. So that was not what was originally intended for Espacio Público, but it was good in the end, And so we had to be more flexible, and that flexibility was in the end very positive for us. So this is the graph that summarizes what I was telling you. Up until 2015, we mainly lived based on core funding. We did have some project funding back then, but very limited. 2016, we had a huge shock in terms of our income. We kept receiving some, in terms of our core funding. And as I said before, we started this new business model at the beginning of 2016, and we started reaping the fruits only in 2017. So that was a very, very tough year for us in terms of our earnings. We could survive because we had some savings from the previous years. But it takes time. And in 2017, what you see there, this is probably the most relevant part. You see that we moved from having 80% core funding to having 20% core funding, and 80% of other funding, mostly project funding, but also a little bit of local funding. And that takes me to the last slide. Basically, what are the pending challenges here? This is we don't have the cliff up there anymore. We are stable in terms of our funding, and that is great. In terms of if you look 3 years back, that is great. But if we want to keep walking and get up to the top of that mountain there, we have to do other things, and what we see today is that we need to maintain what we've achieved in terms of our project funding. But we need to complement that. We need to diversify that with local funding, and we now have we actually could convince the board to be a little bit more flexible in terms of our funding policies. We told them, we need funding that is not attached necessarily to projects, and that comes from local donors, corporations, and individuals with a huge list of conditions to ensure we don't have the conflict of interest that I mentioned at the beginning. But we did make that change. That was a difficult change, and now this is probably the most relevant challenge that Daniel Garcia, who's the new executive director starting a week ago, that he will have during his administration. And that's a story that I hope he can tell you in a couple of years, and I'm sure that will be another successful story. But that's a pending challenge. And why is that a pending challenge? Because we want to recover the capacity to work on those issues that we think are essential. For instance, health policy. We started off working with core funding in healthcare policy back in 2013. After that, we were unable to get international funding to do that, and that is something that is really, really I mean, that's a high priority for Chile. That's a high priority for us, and so we're going to look for local funding to develop those kinds of projects. So I'll stop here, and I'm very glad to listen to your questions, and thank you very much for listening to this story.
Thank you, Guillermo. That was excellent, and I think it complements quite nicely the interview you gave to us a couple of months ago, and I encourage people to read through it. Okay, so now we have Julie Lefrant from TTI, who will join with some comments and questions. Julie?
Can you hear me? And Kike, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Guillermo, for this amazing presentation. This is obviously a very timely moment for all those think tanks that have been involved in the TTI over the past 9 or so years as the TTI comes to an end in 2019. So I guess from a funder's perspective, I just had 2 quick questions for you, and then I want to make sure we have lots of time for others on the line. But how throughout this whole change process did Espacio Público manage to maintain credibility with funders, research collaborators, and different policy actors? I mean, I'm assuming there was something here around timely and transparent and clear communications with external stakeholders. I'm just curious to understand how one would maintain credibility through such turmoil, times of real uncertainty and change.
Great question. So what first thing, this is something that for all of us who were there inside of Espacio Público, we could see this happening, but from the outside you couldn't really see the change too much. So in terms of policy actors, which was one of the groups you mentioned, that's not something they probably they had no idea all of this was going on behind the scenes, you know. In terms of our funders, we did have this conversation, as I said before, with our main core funder. We did have this conversation, and we basically, the argument was, you know, if you cut the funding from one day to the other, all of your investment or all of the support you've been giving us up until now may end up in nothing, because that could be too drastic in terms of our income. So we did have that conversation with them. With other funders, we also talked about it, and we actually did receive support from some of them, thinking about, you know, some of them told us, you know, why don't we work around a large project that can also build your institutional capacity, you know? And so that was also a very, very, very good thing. Other funders are more distant, and they had no idea about what was going on inside, you know. But we just I think we were able to maintain credibility because we kept doing good work, you know. Yeah, and then the other group that you mentioned, which is our research collaborators. The difficult thing here was, well, first of all, we had to change almost all of our research team, and it had always been difficult for our researchers to get to a right balance in terms of their research interests and our board members' interests. But now you added a third actor, which was our funders, right? And as I think I mentioned, all funders have their strategic agendas, their strategic priorities, you know. And so now we had to get 3 people on the table, right? And that was a little bit more difficult. But in terms of credibility, as I said, you know, I think it was key to just keep doing good work, to keep making good proposals and coming up with good ideas for our work in Chile and in the region, and that's it, you know.
Great, Guillermo. Maybe just one quick follow-up looking at the sort of inverse of those external stakeholders. Can you tell us a little bit about how the management team managed to maintain trust with the staff? I know it was an all-of-organizational approach. It sounded quite participatory in nature. I'm sure that was part of the story, but how do you maintain trust with the staff and keep that goodwill and investment in an organization when there's so much uncertainty?
Oh yes, that is a very big challenge, and it's not easy, we were. I was really transparent with the team in terms of what was going on, about the challenge that we had in front of us. I was not totally. I did not share every number. Because I don't know, I thought it was, and that was my take on this. I thought it would be difficult for them to understand the numbers, and because when you work in on projects, you don't have the stability that you have when you work with core funding. That's obvious, right? And basically, when you make your projections in terms of your income, it will all depend on whether you get two other projects that you applied for, 4 of them, 10 of them, and so it's very, very uncertain, as you mentioned, and so I did not share every single number with the team because I didn't want them to freak out, but they were very, very aware of the challenge that we had, and sharing the burden among the whole team made it really. I think that was part of keeping their trust, in the management, because they knew we were all working really hard for this. We had a strategy. We were moving into that strategy, and we asked them for commitment. We were very committed, and that made it all work, But it was not easy, because my concern was basically what you're suggesting, that when people start to see that this is crumbling, they'll just say, I better get another job, But we did. We have a clearly defined purpose of what we want to do. So we had that. That was it was key to have the purpose always on the table, always in mind. And then we had this strategy, and it worked, and I'm very, very proud of what happened. But as I said, it was not easy at all,
Thanks very much. I'll leave space for Ana Patricia now to come in before we go to the rest of the participants.
Thank you, Julie. Ana Patricia?
Thank you, Guillermo, for that excellent presentation, and congratulations on all your success. I know you're heading out, but you're leaving behind so much excitement, and we're looking forward to continue working with Espacio Público. So some of the questions I have, and as it was mentioned in the beginning, Grupo Faro just went through a transition process, as Espacio Público did, and also Grupo Faro is losing its core funding this year. I think those things are separate issues, but it turns out that they coincided in both organizations. So we're kind of suffering through the same challenges. So some of the questions that I will have, of course, selfishly reflect on what I'm thinking about every day, and I hope it's helpful for other folks as well. So one of the things that maybe we could spend a little bit of time on is staff turnover. And I guess our experience is, if we depend too much on initiatives, and as you mentioned very clearly, the funders have their own interests, their own agendas, and probably the staff you need have very specialized skills. So how do you manage reducing staff turnover? So I guess the first question is, has staff turnover increased? Although you did that personally in the beginning, and if it does, how do you manage having a stable core group of people working on the issues you care about?
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's a very, very relevant issue here. So, well, as you mentioned, we as part of the strategy, we had to make that big initial change in the staff, right? one of the things I didn't mention when I talked about the core funding era is that it had a lot of benefits. You know, we could do whatever we wanted to do as long as we were setting up a think tank, right? But it did have some disadvantages from my point of view, which has to do with the fact that we did not have deliverables with deadlines, you know, and that meant that things could be slower. I was a bit nervous in terms of that. Projects could get a bit slower than they would actually be, and that would also that was also not very challenging for our team. You know, we were so dependent on the board members who were the senior researchers for the research projects, that it was not very challenging. Once we moved into this new business model, the team was way more empowered, you know, and that made it way more exciting, way more challenging. And what you see is that after that change, there was very little staff turnover in general in the organization, you know. Now, when you look specifically at the research team, you do see some turnover there, and part of it has to do with what you're mentioning. You know, we had to. There was one person who left at the beginning of this year because after 2 years applying to different things in her area, it didn't work. You know, none of the projects came up, and so yeah, we simply could not afford to keep her on the team. You know, that was very tough. You know, what my take on this is that our researchers, they have to be flexible. You know, we cannot have a team of researchers that are super specialists in one specific issue. Once we need that, we will hire a consultant specifically for a short period of time. But our staff researchers, they have to be flexible. You know, I love the MPP sort of the Master of Public Policy training, because they can go from one issue to the other, and that gives you more flexibility. You can be working on one issue this year because you get the funding, and then another issue the other year. Of course, I mean issues that are relative to the other. You know, I mean that are close relatives to one another. You can't work on energy one day and then the other day be working on health policy necessarily, you know. Yeah, those are some thoughts there, but it is a very important challenge in terms of, especially in terms of the research team, right? For the rest of the organization, for us, it was not. It was, as I said, even the contrary. You know, it was challenging. It was really exciting for the team, and that was positive.
Thank you. So building on that and on the kind of difference between the research group and the rest, or the mix of staff, and again, it's something I'm constantly thinking about, how you balance being a research organization versus being an advocacy organization versus being a program provider. I mean, and I don't think you've gone that far with Espacio Público, but I know you have that mix. And so my original question was, has this new model changed your research, let's say not long-term, but at least medium-term research agenda, because you depend so much on funding? And if so, how much of that balance, advocacy versus research or other activities, has changed, and does that concern you?
Mm-hmm. Oh yes, it is actually. You know, we're currently Espacio Público is undergoing something that I started and will be finished under Danielle's during Danielle's administration. We started off a 4-year planning process with the board, because one of the questions there, we started this at the end of last year, and it will end in the next couple of months. One of the big questions there was, you know, after our first 5-6 years, are we still doing what we wanted to do in the beginning? That's what took us, what took the executive president Mauricio and me to push for this strategic planning process to take place. You know, it is a question. You know, and what I can tell you as of now is that it is pretty much what I already mentioned. We did move to do some things that were not originally planned, like doing some regional work, like doing some projects, right? I don't know if I'm too optimistic, but I think that all of those changes were in the end really positive for the organization. In terms of the regional work, if you're working with international organizations, that's just part of what you have to do. We started off the Latin American Anti-Corruption Network last year, and that's key for us in terms of our of course of making a contribution in that issue in the region, but also in terms of our funders, of showing them that we can lead a regional initiative, and that's key. Yeah, I think that's part of the story. Yeah, it's difficult to manage to get the balance. I remember I read on think tanks. I remember it was someone from Romania or I don't know where exactly was the think tank from. Maybe Enrique can remember. And I read this about 3 or 4 years ago, and one executive director from a think tank there said, this is a tension that you have to live with. You have to learn to live with the tension of having your programmatic objectives and dealing with your donors' programmatic objectives, and that's just something you have to live with, and I think that, as I said before, we were able to keep working on the issues that we want to work, but we were not able necessarily to work on some of those issues. We're not doing things just for the money. We've really avoided to do that, although the temptation, once you have the cliff right there, is really high. We avoided to do that, but there's a tension, and there's a tension you just have to manage all the time.
Thank you. So one last question, so we can leave time for others. This has been very helpful, and I love to chat later on more in detail. So I had other questions, but this one I see someone else is also interested in the. I guess the way you call it, the streamlining of the proposal process. My original question was around how do you, in the article, in the interview, you mentioned that you have kind of 2 strategies. One, setting up targets for individual researchers, and also targets for the area directors. I don't know exactly how do you call them. And then in this webinar, you mentioned the streamlined process, and I know people are interested in that as well. So if you could spend a little bit more time on that, because I'm also currently struggling with what's the right process, the right incentives, the right people to do it. As you said, there's a need for not as much specialization, but also you need a skill to write proposals. So overall, how does that streamlining process work, and how do you do it with researchers who may not have that skill or interest?
Yes. Oh, great question. In terms of the targets, this is something that was we had a long discussion with the board. I told them, now that we have a more senior staff, I want to establish targets, because I want them to have it very clear, to have it very clear that they need to do an important part of the fundraising in this organization, And the board said, what? Oh yeah, are you sure? We're a bit afraid they could be overwhelmed by the targets. They're researchers, as you said, and in the end, it's our responsibility as board members to get the funding, And I said, yes, that is your responsibility, but I think we need to delegate that responsibility on our staff, And I ended up getting it. I could establish those targets. And as I explained before, there's an individual target for researchers, and then there's an aggregate target for the international relations director, who is in charge of coordinating all of the proposals that are produced in Espacio Público. So one thing with the targets is that this is always you always want to be ambitious, but you still want to be realistic, because otherwise they don't work. That's like the 101 there. But the other thing was, for me, was key. You know, in the first year, we just set up a target, defining target that it was not, we did not have solid ground on which to get the number, you know, because it was the first year. So we actually did not get to the target at the end of 2016. We did get to the target in 2017. We actually got almost 15% over the target. But then I have the philosophy that the target itself is not enough. You know, and this was part of the conversation. This relates to Julie's question, right? It's not like they came up and we hired them and we told them, oh, now you're in charge of getting $100,000 US during this year. It's like, what? How do I do that? You know, what the conversation with them was, you know, you're in charge of getting this funding, but we're gonna provide all the context you need for that to happen, right? And so our international relations director was key there, because she's the one who's getting all, as I said, all the paperwork, all the administrative part, all the institutional information that's pretty much the same from one proposal to the other. And basically what you ask researchers is to get the content, right? To get the methodology, to get the research questions, right? And so in order for the targets to make sense to the team, they needed this context, right? And in terms of streamlining the process, basically we created, I'm an engineer, so basically I created like this flow chart where, you know, you knew exactly where to pass the baton from one person to the other, and you know, after 2 years that we've had that process, we don't even look at it anymore. We do it automatically, but we did need it at the beginning, right? And to make sure that you're in charge of getting this kind of information, you're in charge of providing this, you're in charge of insisting the donor, to make sure everyone knew exactly what their responsibility was. As I said, we don't even look at it anymore because the team does it automatically, but it was really necessary back then, because as I said before, this involves a lot of people in the organization, right? And so you need to make sure that is properly done. We did not do it right before. We have Eleni. I don't know if Eleni is here. She told me she was going to be listening to this here. If you're there, hi Eleni. She's a marvelous professional, and it was great. Also because she's a very good professional, as I said. But in the past, this was not happening correctly before she got there, you know. And so this is not something that happens automatically. You have to get it running. But once you have the machine going, it can run on its own, you know.
Thank you. I'll let Kike ask for some questions, but this has been very helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ana Patricia.
Thank you, Ana Patricia. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Guillermo, as well. I think before I go to a few questions, and I've listed those who've said they want to ask a question, so I'll go in order. But before I go to the questions, I think one of the things I like about this story is that this is a story about investing in change. So it isn't about just taking a rash decision, and it isn't about expecting results overnight. Luckily, it's a success story, certainly so far, which shows us, you know, what the returns can be to that investment, and that struggle that Espacio Público had to go through in 2016, but also the learning process that the organization had to go through, and often we struggle to act until we have all the answers. And I think it's quite clear in this story that a lot of the answers came up along the way, and also a lot of the questions came up along the way. So let me go to the participants with questions. Let me start with Diacalia first, and then Vitrina, who had questions about the board. And I'm going to ask you all to please keep your questions short so that we have time for Guillermo to answer them. We'll go through a couple of questions and then answer, and then go back. Okay. So Diacalia, do you want to ask the question?
My question is about the board. You had 12 scholar founding members of this organization, and you said that all 12 were made up the board, but the board was renewed every 2 years. So I'm trying to understand, were all the 12 members at one time and change the responsibility within the board, or what has this happened? And also, board members are very critical. All the organizations that we worked with during the last 9 years, if the board fails, there's a lot of chance that the organization doesn't go anywhere. And how the board members were really able to maintain their guiding, their orientation responsibilities and do that very well while they're being supported by some junior researcher to be doing some research, I guess. And how could they really do that in addition to their own research interests? Thank you.
And just to add to that, Bettina, you had a question about the board as well.
A question about the board. First of all, I'm sorry because I missed a good part of the presentation. My question is, the board was very active at the beginning because the co-grant was there, and they, if I got you very well, is that they are more or less the researchers. So the funding is there, it's very easy to do research. But in this changed business model now, where now the researchers, are the ones, the employees of the organization are ones who are looking for the funding. So how do you foresee what is happening to the involvement and active involvement of the board, and what do you foresee in future? Will they still be very much actively involved in looking for money, or what would happen? What do you foresee?
Oh yes, very good question. Thank you very much, Kalia and Vitrina. So yeah, first of all, a technical thing in terms of how the board gets renewed every 2 years. It's not a complete renewal. Half of the board ends their period every 2 years, and they can all be re-elected. But we have a mandate that says that 25% of all the ones who are elected every 2 years have to be new. So it's just a way to get new oxygen into the board. But it's not like every 2 years you get a completely new board. So most of the board members are the original ones. The other ones started 4 years ago, So it's a way more stable than it makes. Maybe I was not clear enough when we got to that part. So now going to the other question, how do you keep the board on board, right? How do you keep the board motivated? How do you keep them involved? That's very it's a very good point. What happened to us was that in this new model, when you have researchers that are more autonomous, even though some board members were originally a little bit nervous about giving more space to these researchers who are way more junior than they are, it ended up being good because given that they are so busy, given that they have so many other responsibilities apart from being an Espacio Público board member, they were really happy to have a counterpart, an internal counterpart in Espacio Público who would produce reports, papers that were of a much higher level than in the past. We all know, we've all worked with recent college graduates, and they are still learning. But when you have 7, 8 years of experience, you already come with that knowledge of how to write, how to do the research, etc. So it was also more motivating for them to have a more relevant counterpart on inside. Now, how do we keep their interest? That is a very, very interesting question. And that's actually a concern that I have. This has worked for the past 5 years, you know, but 5 years is still not the long run, you know. I mean, my concern is that maybe after 2 more years they get burned out and they say, you know, I have so many other things. Espacio Público is a great organization. I've loved being here, but I can no longer commit my time to this, you know, and that's a concern that I have. My take there is to make sure that what we do here at Espacio Público is really aligned with their like deeper interests in terms of policy. You know, this is really that something that that's fun, that's interesting, that's enriching for them. You know, that, and that's part of the continuous relationship, of maintaining that continuous relationship with our board. It is not easy, and there are some board members who simply, you know, for example, we have 2 board members who are specialists on healthcare. You know, we were unable to provide interesting work for them for the past 3 or 4 years. You know, and that is a problem that we have. And so it's not easy to continue to get them involved, to keep their motivation up. You know, but you know, it's as I said, some of them will simply just not continue motivated, maybe not continue in the board. But I think it is possible to do it with the majority.
Great, thank you, Guillermo. We had a couple of questions that you've answered already about proposal production, but Job had a question about the new staff that came into the organization. Job, do you want to ask that question about new staff and their skills? Are you there, Joe? I'll ask it.
Hello.
Oh, hey, hi, Joe. Hi.
Hello.
Yes.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Guillermo, thank you very much for the presentation. I have a question around the new research staff that you hired. I wanted to find out whether you hired researchers that already have knowledge in resource mobilization, or did you hire them to train them? I wanted to know how you were able to achieve that.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. Good question, Job. They did not have experience. It's very difficult to find researchers that do have that prior experience, you know. And so basically what we told them, as I said before, is that, you know, we're gonna help you in this. You know, you're not here on your own. I'm, as executive director, I play an important role in providing, as I said before, strategic guidelines. We have Eleni, the international relations director, key actor, key support, I mean, crucial support for their research mobilization effort. You know, they should. Having said that, you know, it is key to have researchers who have enough seniority to be able to come up with a decent, and more than decent, a good, ideally a very good research project, right? Moving from an idea, as you all know, moving from an idea of a project to a proper project is a very difficult thing to do, you know? And when we tried to do that with our junior researchers back in the day, and that did not work. They simply did not have the seniority to face a problem and say, you know, face an issue and say, you know, we should formulate this research question. We should think about this methodology, you know, but that's part of being a researcher, you know, and they have to be senior enough to be able to do that. That would be my recommendation, you know. If they cannot do that in their own right, if they have to depend on that, to do that on someone else, then they will not work for something like this.
Thank you, Guillermo. I think you've answered a question by Sulamba about how to motivate staff as well. And so I'm mindful of time. I want to finish with asking about a question about funding. Musambia has a question about the sources of funding in Chile. Musambia?
Yeah, I wanted to know, because you said that the organization shifted from a core grants base to local, to depend now on local funding. I wanted to know if from the local sources, which one is that the government, the private sector, or the local donor community in Chile? And I also have another question regarding the timing, because the organization started in 2013, and where it depended on core grants. Coming to 2017, there was a shift. Now the organization is now a self-reliant. So it is a short time. I feel 4 years. First of all, congratulations for that, because it is a great effort to come to that point. But I wanted to know if, yes, changing the business model was one part of it, but I wanted to know about the status of the board members and the staff also in Chile. Was that a point of reference that helped the organization to access the local funding, or what? And also the area of intervention. Do you feel tough competition? Because having short time of 4 years in an organization, then to come and then to tell us such kind of impressive history is really impressive in nature. Thank you for those points.
Thank you, and that's a good way to end. Gives you a few questions to answer, Guillermo, and a way to end. Is Espacio Público alone in Chile, or do you face tough competition from other think tanks who are offering the same or similar service?
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Musambia. So in terms of local funding, we're still very cautious about getting government funding. That's our. I know other think tanks do that intensively, and I think it's a good thing. You can do that, making sure that I don't know. I think you can do that. We haven't gone too much into government funding because Chile is a small country. We know that if we do consulting to the Secretary of Environment, and then we want to have an independent opinion on what they're doing, we're going to receive a call from the minister to one of the board members saying, you're doing this consulting work with us. How come you're now like hitting us on the newspapers? And so we know that's going to happen, so we want to avoid that. We've dedicated our efforts mostly to the private sector, and to be honest, we have no corporations funding Espacio Público up until now. So that, as I said, that's a big challenge for my successor, Daniel. And basically what we did was to establish a members program. We went to individuals who could provide funding. I'm talking about, just to have like a reference, these are people who are supporting Espacio Público on average with around $1,000 per year, right? So this is a not a very large group. It's people who can, of course, provide funding that's way more than they would give, I don't know, like a $10 monthly donation to Greenpeace. But it's still not super huge. And now we're moving into getting to very high earning people to get more relevant funding, but still from individuals or from family foundations from these people. That's with regard to local funding. Timing, timing is in our experience in Espacio Público, we have several projects that are that have a budget over $300,000, right? None of those projects took less than 1 year. On average, it took 18 months, a year and a half, to get those projects secured, right? So when you want to think about big projects it takes time, you know, and in terms of that, and that's what I totally agree with Enrique, and you saw that in the numbers, right? You know, in 2016, even though we had been working like crazy around this new business model, we could not reap the benefits yet. It took us until the next year, you know, and so that is very important for you guys to keep in mind and to plan and to be patient, you know. So it is key. In terms of the area of intervention, the competition, you know, Chile, there are some very important think tanks in the think tank community in Chile. They do a lot of work, but basically they receive all their funding from corporations, which is, as I said before, something we did not want to do, and now we're doing very cautiously. So they have a very different business model than we do, right? So we don't really have that much competition in Chile, right? Once you look at this more regionally, of course there are other think tanks doing the same kinds of things, right? And they're connecting to your question. The seniority of our board members was key. You know, when we get to the international, the Inter-American Development Bank, and they know that we have a former economics professor at Yale, like Eduardo Engel, heading the project, they trust in this. You know, even with that, it takes time, but that's key. The role of our board members in ensuring the seriousness of our work has been key. You know, I can give you several examples of projects that basically have worked because we have them on the team, you know, and they know they're gonna do the quality control of what we're gonna be doing, you know, and so you know, that has been a key ingredient for us. You know, probably other think tanks will have very different governance and structure, you know, but for us that was key. Of course, there's, you know, I was talking about this yesterday with Danielle, with my successor. You know, when you go to global, when you go to some global funders that are looking at, I don't know, different regions of the world, it is very difficult for an OECD country like Chile to get their interest. You know, in that sense, probably in Africa you're in much better shape to be competitive. You know, we don't have that much to offer in terms of needs, in terms of when, I don't know, it's very difficult for us to compete on the global arena as of now. You know, I hope we get beyond that in the next few years, but now that is an arena that's very tough for us yet.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you, Guillermo, for the presentation, the answers to these very good questions. Thank you, everybody who joined, Julie and Ana Patricia, for your intervention, and everybody else who's joined with questions and just listening in. We'll be sharing the video of this webinar with you, and then there'll be a series of other webinars coming along, which will include a discussion on crowdfunding for think tanks and a very exciting and innovative fundraising strategy developed by a think tank in Africa at CC in Nigeria, in fact. So that's all from us. Thank you very much, and I hope you've enjoyed it. And again, thank you very much, Guillermo, for joining us today and for the excellent interview. And congratulations on what looks like an interesting success story, and also a very a story that motivates, I think, all of us to think more about business models and how we can bring about change in an organization.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, especially Enrique, for the invitation.
Okay.
Thank you all.
Great. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you.